One of the most common problems I hear from athletes over the last 15 years as a strength and conditioning coach and personal trainer is that athletes want to be faster in a game. The goal with game speed is one of two things. You are either creating space to distribute the ball, make a run, shake a defender, or create some kind of opportunity, or you're taking space, shutting down opponents defensively, applying pressure, and otherwise limiting the available options for an opponent. For team sport athletes, the biggest difference maker is their acceleration capabilities. Even when it comes to close quarters change of direction, an athlete will have to make multiple accelerations to attack new space. However, what I've learned is that most athletes aren't doing things that actually make them faster. In fact, it might surprise you to learn that most athletes are putting loads of efforts into activities that aren't building breakaway speed or ankle breaking quickness. What you need to understand first is that it's 100% possible to build faster acceleration that will help you create separation or play lockdown defense. What most coaches and athletes miss is that there are two key components that are absolutely non-negotiables when it comes to building speed. In this video, I'm going to break down these two components for you first, and then give you my most successful drills for building explosive speed so you can build fast athletes faster without wasting effort or wondering if it'll work. Many athletes believe that if they were just a little bit stronger, they could be faster. But what if I told you the fastest guy on the team was rarely also the strongest in the gym? On the flip side, many athletes and coaches like yourself try adding more sprints, but the athletes end up tired, broken down, and just not much faster. This is because great speed requires applying the right forces in the right direction at the right time. Getting stronger, yes, can be a factor in improving speed, but many athletes chase more weight on the bar, teaching them how to push over a long period of time. When you train speed, you actually have to learn how to create higher forces with increasingly shorter periods of time. These two things at some point work in opposition. In fact, many athletes I work with don't optimize the amount of strength they already have. This is because most athletes don't know how to apply forces in the right direction. What elite sprinters do better than anyone else isn't just that they produce more force, it's that they can direct it in a way that optimizes how far their body moves forward. What's interesting is that most athletes intuitively understand this. If you want to jump as far as possible, you have to create a nice balance between how high you jump and how far you jump. If you're too low, you don't have enough air time to actually go forward. And if you're too high, you just go straight up. Being efficient with your speed works very much in the same way. You have to know how to push the ground effectively to go forward. I'm going to share with you the key area I focus on with my young athletes, and then give you two specific drills that you can use to maximize acceleration, either with yourself or with your athletes. First, where you position yourself to watch sprints is absolutely essential. The side view is going to give you the most insight into how effective the acceleration is. Why? Well, good sprinting is the byproduct of stride length and stride frequency. Let's break this down. Stride length is how far you travel with each step. It's made up of two components: how far you travel when your foot is in contact with the ground, which we call contact distance, and how far you travel in the air, which is largely the result of how much force you are able to apply to the ground. Stride frequency is measured by how many strides you take each second. This is a combination of contact time, or how long you're on the ground pushing, and air time, which is how long you spend in the air. These are both best observed from the side view. These two things are very hard to measure in practice and can confuse many athletes and coaches because they are interdependent, meaning when you change one significantly, it greatly impacts the other. Take, for example, if I were to ramp up my stride length to a large degree, I tend to overstride and reduce my stride frequency. This is considered generally inefficient. And on the flip side, if my stride frequency is too low and I try to amplify it, I end up with Scooby-Doo. Lots of turnover, but very little progression of my hips in space. Zoinks! So you might be asking yourself, what should I be looking at? And the answer is pretty simple. You see, the shin is like an organic compass. If I were to draw an arrow from the ankle through the knee, this is indicative of how you are applying force to the ground and ultimately which direction you are going. Good shin angles distinguish great accelerators from mediocre ones, and it has little to do with gym strength. Let's break down the two key problems that poor shin angles contribute to, and we'll talk about how to improve them next. If you have too vertical of a shin angle, two key things are going to happen that are going to literally destroy your acceleration. Number one, you're going to increase the braking impulses. When you land too far in front of your center of mass, you actually create a braking impulse. This means that the first part of ground contact, you are actually slowing down. In order to effectively sprint, we want to minimize the impact of these braking forces. And the best way to do this is to shorten the touchdown distance. That's the distance between your hip and your foot. We'll talk more about this in the demonstration. And the second thing that happens is it's literally aiming you more vertically. Because the shin acts as a compass, a vertical shin means that your athletes will pop up prematurely, thwarting their ability to accelerate with low angles. Now, let's talk about how to detect these shin angles. The three-step burst. This activity is as simple as it sounds. You are doing the first 3 steps of your acceleration with one key difference. Now, you know what we're looking for, and we'll talk about how to improve it. One of the challenges we're up against is that athletes have very congested schedules with lots of competing commitments. If we couple this with the fact that developing speed requires what we call the 3 Fs, fresh, fast, and focused, we find ourselves in an area with very few reps to solve this acceleration problem. And like I said before, this isn't something you can just fix in the gym. So we need abundant opportunities to work this without annihilating our athletes and impacting their recovery. That's the beauty of the 3-step burst. Most athletes will only hit a small percentage of their max velocity within 3 steps. And for most team sport athletes, these are the most crucial for creating space you need to dominate in competition. Now, as we apply the 3-step burst to our team sport athletes, we have to be mindful and consider the differences between our team sport athletes and our track athletes. In most situations, when we're talking about sprints with track athletes, they're going to be coming low out of block starts, and they're going to have something to actually push against. One of the primary differences, and really the one I want you to consider today, is that our team sport athletes are going to have to get some exposure to creating powerful and low angled accelerations from higher starting positions. When we're in the gym or when we're working on the technical development of sprints, we can still use some of these lower starting positions for our three-point start to give our athletes just a felt sense of what good and powerful acceleration is like, so they can start to model this in some of their other activities. So let me show you the first position that we really like to work on with our 3-step burst. It's going to be a half kneeling start. And this is probably our favorite for a number of reasons. One, it's easy to really bias projection or pushing the hips forward with this single leg, and allows athletes time and space to actually angle their trunk and find a good acceleration angle. Now, I talked about the shin being the organic compass, but we can also use the trunk. So I don't want my athletes to come too low where it looks like they've got a backpack with a ton of books on it, and I don't want them to rise up and lift their chest and extend too much. And so this half kneeling position really affords us a unique opportunity to create good projection for our athletes. And so what we'll do is we'll start this position. You can start in a basic half kneel. We'll load the front leg by hinging slightly at the hip, and then we're going to bring our weight forward. And then they can also use the arms to powerfully extend as they go into their 3-step burst. And we already talked about some of the strategies of, hey, what happens if they overstride? What happens if they understride? And again, depending on how my athlete executes this, one of my strategies might be to take the athlete and say, hey, you're overstriding. Let's make that stride as long as possible. Now, with a 3-step burst, they're not going to get a ton of velocity, but I might encourage them to actually feed into their problem a little bit more. And what this does is it gives them a sense of how extreme this technique can be and how awful it feels at the extremity. But what I might do on the next rep is actually say, okay, now I want you to turn it over as fast as you can. Give me the fastest 3 steps that you've ever done. And I'll ask them to actually make a caricature of this, meaning I want you to exaggerate what I'm asking you so that these 3 steps are super fast. What this does is it starts to give the athletes a bandwidth of understanding for what the 2 ends of the spectrum are with regard to their technique. And it allows them to find the sweet spot of what is going to be optimal. And what optimal looks like, we've discussed it and alluded to it, but I'm going to reiterate here, is we get good projection, so the hips are actually traveling forward in space, but at the same time, they're able to get that front leg back down to the ground with the appropriate shin angles to continue to progress the acceleration. And so one end of the spectrum might be 2 long strides, 2 long of strides, and the next example might be, okay, let's ramp up the frequency here. And so now they are going nowhere fast, literally. And on the third example, they might have just an understanding of how to get good air time, but how to actually strike back. I'm far from world class, but hopefully you can see that the third sprint was significantly different and likely better than the first 2. And your athletes are going to have the same experience as you work with them and you give them some understanding. Now, will you have to do this every week? It's very unlikely that they'll need this drill. Usually a couple times, and they start to understand what you mean when you're communicating. Next, I want to talk about some other positions that we really like for the 3-step burst. Obviously, I've alluded to my favorite, which is going to be the half kneel, but we may take athletes even lower and put them in to a push-up start. Initially, we start by segmenting this. We push up, and I want them to do it not like this, but with a stable core. So head to heel, strong as steel. We'll bring the knee forward, not too far forward because that's a vertical shin and it's going to pop me up. For your stronger athletes, this is going to teach them how to create just enough rise and continue their sprint. You'll find some of your weaker athletes really struggle with this position for one of 2 reasons. One, they're not strong enough to actually push out of this, and so they get a second step vertically. The second is they don't know how to actually snap back fast from low angles, and they'll also hit in front of their center of mass. Depending on the unique situation of your athlete, you may like to use this to really work on certain aspects of improving their acceleration. The next position that we like, a 2-point start. Because we have team sport athletes, because they're more upright, we want to bring their center of mass higher and challenge them to create effective acceleration angles from higher positions. Now, sometimes athletes, admittedly, will get into the stance. They won't really load appropriately. When you clap or say go, or if they're racing somebody, what they're going to do is they're actually going to reposition and use that to get their initial step. A lot of coaches call this the false step. We call it a reposition step. But when I'm doing a static start sprint drill like this, I want to minimize that repositioning step. I want them to feel how to load and how to get that initial burst off of that leg. If they reposition, it's not really a bad thing. We're still going to get 3 steps from there. Another position that I like is from some multi-direct. So if I'm going into a cut, I'm going to make a wide plant angle. We also like to do this from a half kneeling position. So if I take this cutting angle, I chop them off at the knee, now I have a wide plant angle, and I can work on redirecting my body and going into a 3-step burst. So we start here, we load the front leg the same way, and then we push, and of course you're going to see the front leg boom or attack back to the ground. So we might say boom the ground, and that's a cue for them to strike back a little bit harder. And we'll also take this position and raise their center of mass up. Now we're just in what we call a lateral stance or defensive position. We have a plant angle that is outside of our hips, and we can use this to actually create our 3-step burst. Looks like a baseball player getting ready to steal some bags, but a very effective position, and these are probably what we use a majority of the time. Athletes understand this, they're easy to execute, and we can really diagnose and detect any inefficiencies within their sprint technique. The second activity that I want to discuss is the skip for distance. Now, this activity might look very simple, painfully so, but I promise you, it's super effective for team sport athletes. I talked earlier about the importance of projecting at the right angle. If I'm too low, I don't go anywhere. If I'm too high, I also don't go anywhere, even if my hips travel high. And athletes understand this on a very intuitive level. Whether I've got a soccer player, a baseball player, a basketball player, or a football player, they know that if the ball needs to travel far, that it's going to go in an arc. It's not going to be a line drive. If I'm deep in the outfield and I need to throw it to home, there's fat chance I can throw a perfect line drive. I have to give that ball a little bit of lift. Likewise, if I want to kick a soccer ball downfield, I'm going to hit it so that it's in a nice arc. And this arc, this rising and steady falling, is what I want athletes to think about when they think about how their hips are traveling. I don't want the hips too flat. I don't want the hips to just come up like they're going up a half pipe and coming straight down. I want the hips to travel in this arc. And so when we start to break down what the skip for distance looks like, and we give athletes experience to projecting too low, to projecting too high, to projecting in a way that's going to get them across the turf in as few strides as possible, they start to understand how to apply the right forces for sprinting with the right direction. This is very similar to how they are going to launch out of their position and create the right opportunities for them to hit the ground with the shin coming backwards and project themselves forward. If you made it this far in the video, thank you. If you're still watching, you might be thinking, there's no way my athletes or myself is going to get faster actually using these drills. They're just too simple. I would counter with this. Let's say you're a basketball player and you want to improve your shot. And let's say right now you shoot down here and you just always have. And now we need you to shoot up here so that you don't get stuffed every rep. What happens right away? Well, it feels a little off. You're having to think about the positioning of the ball in your hand and your elbow. And it's not going to feel like second nature. And so you might lay a few bricks as you initially adopt this new technique. The technique of sprinting is going to work the same way. You're going to have to go through some painful awkwardness in terms of growth in order to actually arrive at the technique you want. But I promise if you use this experiment of going a little bit into your problem, exploring the opposite end of the spectrum where maybe things were cycling too fast or vice versa, and then finding that sweet spot, you'll be able to get a felt sense of what good sprinting feels like. And if you track your times, I promise that you're going to see improvements over time. You see, one of the things that I've noticed after working with numerous high-level athletes all the way to the professional level, it's not that their training is different or fancy, it's that they do the common things uncommonly well. So when I watch them warm up, they do things faster and more explosively than all of my other athletes. When I give them technical cues, they apply them with greater intensity than my lower level athletes. And if you want to bridge the gap, you need to do the simple things very well. These two activities are very adjacent to what you need from a physical perspective to be phenomenal when it comes to sprinting. And so you need to get more exposure doing this. And the three-step burst is a fantastic way to both detect and correct some of the inefficiencies that you might be experiencing. Last but not least, thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to our channel, share this video, and if you're a coach or an athlete and you have questions about how to get faster for yourself or your athletes, reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation with you, and let's build fast athletes faster.